Now you are. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Grant Application Workshop webinar for the Community Outdoor Outreach Program, otherwise known as the Co-op Grant. My name is Rena Beyer. I'm the Co-op Grants Manager, and I am fairly new to this position. I started it in July 1, but I'm not new to grants. So I've had, before this position, I worked with Texas Parks and Wildlife as an interpretive park ranger, and also with Texas Outdoor Family, which many of you may be familiar with. And then prior to that, almost 30 years in the grants field. So lots of experience there. I'd also like to introduce Jessica Lagallo, who is the grant coordinator for the co-op program.
Hello, everyone. I recognize many of you having grants with us in the past, or some of you may have received communication from me about this webinar. I'm the grant coordinator for the co-op program. I've been with the program a little under 4 years, and prior to that, I worked with our outdoor education and outreach program with state parks. I've also had experience as a classroom teacher and also with summer camps and environmental education programs, and hopefully that helps me better support a lot of our grantees. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope that you find the workshop useful in your application. Our contact information is on the screen, and I'm going to pass this back over to Rena.
Thank you, Jessica. So just some logistics. You are at a GoToMeeting. We're using the GoToMeeting platform. This allows you to ask questions live. So I'll be presenting and Jessica will be answering the questions as you ask them. To submit a question, you can find that by locating the question tab on the control panel, the GoToMeeting control panel. Also under control panel, you can find all the co-op grant resources that we'll be referencing in today's webinar. This includes the program guidance manual that we reference in the first half of today's presentation, and a blank application that we will be referencing in the second half of today's presentation. We also sent those by email as attachments with your registration confirmation. How we, oh, sorry, I was just muted for the whole thing. Okay.
Just for that last. We're going to spend about 3 hours today.
Okay, so we're going to, sorry, I was muted, I just learned. We are going to spend about 3 hours together today. The first half of the day you'll be with me, and we're going to be, during that time, we're going to just do an overview of the grant. The second half of the day, you'll be digging in a little deeper with Jessica. So for the first half of the day, we're going to be talking about program requirements and priorities. We're going to be talking about eligibility, what organizations are eligible to apply, and allowable and unallowable expenses that can be included in the grant application. Also going to talk about organizational capacity, things you should consider before you apply. Basically, do you have the capacity to manage this grant from start to finish? Well, there are some things to be, there's no match for the grant, but there certainly is some time match required. And then lastly, for the first half of the day, we'll be talking about how grant applications are scored. So this determines who ultimately receives a grant award. Then we'll have a little break of about 10 minutes, and the second half of the day you'll be with Jessica, and she is going to take a deeper dive into the grant application process, including how to craft a competitive grant application, tips for how to describe your grant proposal to secure the greatest number of points from the grant reviewers. She's also going to talk about SMART goals and what those should look like, the narrative and the timeline. She's also going to talk about relationships. So this grant requires a strong relationship with TPWD. And so she'll be talking about what those requirements and some other resources that we have to offer. And taking a deeper dive into participants and demographics. As you may know, we are very specific about who we want to serve with these grant funds. And then a special surprise at the end of the day, we'll have a guest speaker, Sarah Jose, who is the TPWD Project WILD Coordinator for the state. And she'll be talking about some training opportunities and using Project WILD curriculum in potential grant projects. The very end of the day, we will also have, in addition to that, you can ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll also have a question and answer session at the very end. So let's talk about some of the broad strokes for the grant program. First of all, the purpose of the co-op grant is aligned with the mission of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. The mission statement of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, otherwise known as TPWD, is to manage and conserve the natural and cultural resources of Texas and to provide hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation opportunities for the use of enjoyment of present and future generations. The co-op grant, the purpose of the co-op grant is to provide funding to tax-exempt organizations for programming that engages underrepresented populations, which we will define later today, underrepresented populations in TPWD mission-oriented outdoor recreation, conservation, and environmental education activities. We do this by connecting underrepresented audiences to TPWD sites, resources, and staff. Some examples of projects we've seen in the past, there are many, by the way, but some of them include summer camps, after-school programs, adaptive recreation activities, hunting programs, programs in archery, fishing, kayaking, and so much more. So as we mentioned, we are very specifically looking for serving underrepresented population. The co-op grant program prioritizes direct connections between participants of grant-funded programs and TPWD sites, programs, and staff. You'll hear me repeat that a lot. Specifically for the co-op grant, the participant focus includes minorities, females of any age, low-income households, and or individuals with a disability. As mentioned, this is also included on page 3 of the program guidance. For the co-op grant, we look for programming in one or more of the following 3 areas, which, as you may remember, these 3 areas link back to the purpose of the co-op grant. 1, outdoor recreation. With this, we're looking for programs that can accommodate high quality participation in TPWD mission-oriented outdoor recreation, facilitate access to TPWD owned and operated facilities. Environmental education is also a focus area. Within that, we define that as providing environmental and cultural resource education for Texas natural resources, integration of TPWD education programs to develop TPWD mission-related lifelong behaviors, and conservation. So we're looking to cultivate citizen participation in science-based stewardship of natural and cultural resources that result in tangible conservation benefits. And we are looking to develop the next generation of natural resource leaders and professionals. So to give you a little history of the co-op grant, the co-op grant program, along with several other grant programs, are coordinated and managed through the Recreation Grants Branch, which is part of Texas State Parks within the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. The co-op program began in 1996 to reflect the need to diversify audiences visiting our parks and facilities and engaging in programs. So when we looked at who is visiting, who's using programs, we saw big gaps, and that goes back to those underrepresented populations. What we decided, instead of trying to meet this need within the agency alone, we decided to reach out to support community partners who already have deep relationships with community members and grow their outdoor programs via grant dollars. This would be you. Funds are derived from a percentage of money collected from the sporting goods sales tax. This includes anytime purchases are made related to fishing, hunting, camping gear, etc. This percentage of those taxes come back to our program to fund agencies and organizations, which can further develop purchasers of fishing, hunting, and camping gear. Over the past 25 years, we've awarded 855 grants for a total of $25.9 million throughout Texas. So let's transition to some of the details of the grant itself. This year we have over 2 million, well over 2 million available for grant awards. The request must fall within a range from $5,000 to $100,000. One important thing to note is this grant is a reimbursement-based grant. This differs a little bit from what we've done, at least what we did last year, which we allowed a little bit more advances than we can allow this year. So based on an organizational risk assessment, co-op grant recipients may submit a one-time startup advance payment request for up to 10% of the approved grant amount to assist with the initial startup costs for the grant funds. Organizations who receive a high risk rating on the risk assessment may not be eligible for startup advance funds. So it's really important to know this ahead of time, because if you do not have the funds to make those purchases and then get reimbursed, it may not be the best option for you. After the initial advance of up to 10%, all expenditures are paid on a reimbursement basis only. All expenditures, including for the advance, if applicable, must have receipts and documentation. So it can take up to a month to receive reimbursement for these expenditures. So it's really important to factor this in before you apply for the grant. More information on this payment procedures and processes can be found on page 17 of the program guidance. There's a lot more detail there. Grant applications are submitted online through the Recreation Grants Online, or ARGO system, and we'll talk a little more about that later. The deadline is November 1st at 5:00 p.m. Central Standard Time. It's very important to note we have no exceptions to that rule. It's an online system. At 5:01, it will no longer accept grant applications, and there is absolutely nothing we can do about that. So please start your application early, get your ARGO account started early, and submit as quickly or as early as you can within reason. March 1st, 2025 is when we will announce the grant awards. And then programs who are funded will be funded through March 1st, 2025 to September 1st, 2026. That's an 18-month period. We call this the program performance period. So all activities must fall within that timeline if you want to get reimbursed for those. It's also important to notice that between March 1st and April 15th, there is a grant agreement phase. So even though you'll find out you've gotten your grant on March 1st, and technically you can start programming, you won't be able to get any funding, including that 10% advance, until after that April 15th date. And that's just because we need a little time in our agency to set up the payment systems, develop the contracts, set up payment accounts, etc. So a very important piece to factor in there. So let's look at eligibility. And this also on page 4 of the program guidance, there's more detail there, but some of the highlights that's important to note related to eligibility. You must be a nonprofit, political tax exempt organization. You must have a current IRS designation letter of the nonprofit status designated by the IRS, and it must be submitted with the application. The organization must also have a valid, unique entity identification number, or called UEI. The UEI is issued, we do not issue that, it's issued by the Federal System of Award Management, otherwise known as SAM. UEI must be valid at the time of application. If you look, and this is a whole thing we can talk about later, but on page 9 of the program guidance, it walks you through that process and what that's involved. I will say again, start this early. It usually takes a couple weeks, but I've heard they're backed up. So if you do not have a valid UEI, do begin that process right away. The organization needs also to be in good standing with the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. Applications must have a signed resolution signed by a governing board or authorized official dated within 1 year of the application submission, and the resolution must indicate authorization for authority to submit, including the amount of the grant request. We do have some examples and a fillable template in the resource section of the Argo system. You do not have to use this template, but if you do not use it, the resolution, just be sure it includes those required items. Any past co-op grants must be in closed status, and your organization must not have received an award in the last grant competition. Only one grant award will be granted per organization.
We have a quick question.
Okay.
If the co-op grant is available to other entities besides nonprofits?
It is not. It must be a tax-exempt nonprofit organization.
Actually, we do offer the grant to churches, municipalities, cities. So nonprofits are eligible to apply, meaning a 501c3. Those organizations would need an IRS determination letter, but other entities such as churches, schools, universities, municipalities, those are technically not for-profit entities, but they wouldn't have a 501c3 nonprofit designation. Those entities would not need an IRS determination. Just to clarify that question.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for clarifying that. Applications must, we're still talking about eligibility. Applications must reflect at least one direct approved relationship with TPWD. We do have a handout. I don't know, was that in our, I think that's just on the resource page, right? The TPWD approved relationships.
That's available in the resource section. You can find that on your control panel. It's also was sent out with the confirmation.
Thank you, Jessica. And it's also on page 5 of your program guidance. So we are looking for the TPWD relationship requirement goes back to the purpose of the co-op grant, which is to connect underserved audiences with TPWD sites, resources, and staff within the 3 priority areas of outdoor recreation, environmental education, and conservation. I will say projects with more in-depth, sustained, or multiple exposures to TPWD sites, resources, and staff tend to be more competitive. An example might be simply integrating a project wild activity versus, so that is an approved relationship, versus having multiple overnights in a state park. So which of those might have more influence on a person's lifelong behavior? I would say the one that has the most exposure, such as overnight multiple camping trips to a state park, would probably score higher with grant reviewers than simply 1 or 2 programs related to Project Wild. Not that Project Wild is not approved, because it is. And also note, if the project incorporates direct involvement with the TPWD staff, a letter of commitment is required, such as if you're asking a park interpreter, you're expecting them to do a program, which they very well may be happy to do, or you want to do a Texas outdoor family camp out, or have several sessions with a game warden. All of those require a staff member to commit to that prior to you submitting your grant award, and we require a letter. On that handout of the approved relationships, you will notice some asterisks, and that's if they have an asterisk next to it, that's where we're requiring that letter from the staff. Okay, let's talk about, these are a list. This is not an inclusive list, but eligible project activities. As you can see, it's quite long. It's pretty flexible. They're also included on page 4 of your program guidance, which includes both eligible and ineligible activities. Some of these, as you can see, can be carried out on their own by the agency. Others require more extensive involvement with TPWD staff. Also note that TPWD offers an array of programs and resources that can be incorporated into your project. So again, with all this, as we will hear us say, don't assume that a staff member will be available to you. Please do contact them early and get that letter if applicable, and plan early. Even state parks fill up pretty quickly. So whatever activities you need to do, think them through carefully and plan early. Some of the ineligible activities include arts and crafts. The exception with that, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, I'm just going to talk about some of the main ones. If you're doing an environmental education program, maybe arts and crafts would be applicable there as it relates to your environmental activities, such as maybe nature journaling, something like that. We also do not fund any kind of construction, sheds, storage buildings, trail building. We do not fund trail building. We see that a lot and it is not eligible. We do not fund landscaping or vegetable gardening. So if we see that in your grant application, even if your grant is funded, what will happen is we just simply take those expenses out and you do not have the opportunity to replace those with other activities. So be sure to read this section carefully and include only project or activities that are eligible. If you have questions, please feel free to contact Jessica or myself. Ineligible activities continued. You see that the list is fairly long. The ones I'd like to bring special attention to that we see often included that are not eligible: special events, festivals, or expos that are open to the public. The reason for this is because you don't really have any control of who's going to attend those public events. And we again are looking for those very specific target audiences. And you wouldn't be able to document who's coming and what their income level is and all that kind of stuff. So we do not allow special events, festivals, or expos. We do not allow tournaments or competitive events, hosting those. You can take your participants to tournaments because of course you would know who you're taking to the tournament. So you would be able to document their demographics. But as far as hosting it, again, because you wouldn't know who was going to attend, we do not allow those as a host. Traditional sports or fitness programs, we do not allow those. Two new things that we previously have allowed, but we are no longer allowing. Zip lines, ropes, or obstacle courses are no longer an allowable activity. Also visiting zoos or exotic safaris, because again, we're looking to do, we're expanding TPWD involvement. Some expenses that we do not allow. Again, the list is pretty long there. Some of these might surprise you, such as we do not allow advertising, marketing, and promotional materials, such as brochures, flyers, swag, things like that. We no longer pay benefits. You can pay employees or contractors, but we do not pay the benefits, with the exception of the employer-paid FICA. I'm skimming here to see what else we might see frequently that we not allow. Exhibits, signage, greenhouses or sheds or structures. I mentioned that before. We do. You can buy kayaks and canoes with this funds, but you cannot buy a boat that has a motor, or actually anything that with a motor. All of those are not allowed. If it has a motor, not allowed. Also, prizes or awards or certificates, anything, those are not allowed, and anything given directly to a participant, even including gift cards, tents, gas cards, no direct gifts to participants. Going back, I just want to mention the one exception there is safety related items. So if it's something like a hat, water bottle, t-shirts, because you need to identify your group, we do make that as an exception of something given directly to participants. Okay, so when you are ready to develop your budget, you're going to see these budget categories. And this is all covered on pages 11 through 14 in your program guidance. We do cover personnel and contractors. This can include interns, contractors, stipends, substitute teachers for field trips. All personnel must directly support the approved grant project activities. We do not fund indirect personnel such as admin. So it's sort of the ones that have the boots on the ground, so to speak, are who we fund. We do fund food and travel. Food, we look more favorably to low cost, such as like going to HEB to buy box lunches or making lunches over stopping at a restaurant. There are some exemptions to that, but for the most part, try to stay away from high cost food items. We do not fund parties, recognition dinners, things like that. As I mentioned, we discourage meals at restaurants. They can take up a lot of resources that are intended for programming, so that's why we really look for that return on investment. And again, if we see something that looks exorbitant in your project budget, we will simply take those out. If you have a question, please ask us. There are some exceptions. Travel would include gas and mileage. Of course, those are not the same thing. Mileage would be, say you were taking your own vehicle or a fleet vehicle, you would claim the IRS mileage rate, or gas would be, say you're renting a vehicle and you just need to fill up your tank, that would be gas. So gas, mileage, vehicle rentals, trailer rentals, all those are completely fundable. Under travel also includes lodging and facilities. I want to reiterate here as well that we are much more favorable to covering lodging within our state parks. The parks have barracks, they have shelters, they have group halls, all of that is completely okay. Hotels, any kind of lodging for hotels should be very limited, and we would need a strong justification for the need for that, and it should be a very reasonable cost. In the spirit of the grant and engaging participants in the outdoors, privately owned rental sites such as Airbnb, VRBOs, hip camps, etc., are allowed only in special circumstances, and they require pre-approval. We have had this here and there where groups, maybe there's a group that have disabilities that prevent them from regulating their body temperatures well. So in those cases, we might, especially if it's summer, we might allow lodging outside of the state park if the state park doesn't have appropriate lodging. You will also see a fees category, and this can be, you can include camping fees in here, any kind of fee that directly links to your program. We do not allow fees paid directly to your own organization, however. And you will see an outdoor service project expense. Within this, we will cover things like the cost of materials for outdoor projects related to environmental education and conservation, such you might need things like garbage bags, gloves. If you're doing a native plant project, you might need mulch and shovels. These would be an allowable expense. Here is where you want to be sure you read the program guidance carefully, because remember, we don't allow landscaping. Even creating a pollinator garden or native habitat, if you're doing that, it might be allowable, but it would need to have a demonstrated need and not be used as landscaping. So it would need to come back to the programming piece of it, rather than simply landscaping. We do not fund irrigation systems, fencing, greenhouses, or, as I said before, vegetable gardens. We see that a lot, and it is not allowable. Supplies and equipment. We define equipment as a per unit cost of $5,000 or more. The reason that matters is if you purchase equipment, say you're buying a trailer and it's $5,000 or more, There are some strings attached to that we follow, that we would need to make sure that you adhere to. For example, it would still be yours when the grant ends, but if you were to sell that, you would need to contact us ahead of time. So there's some things like that related to equipment, and that's the only reason I'm mentioning it here. Again, please feel free to call us or contact us if you have questions about that. Around supplies, so supplies and equipment, it could be things such as, here are some of the things that we see most often: outdoor recreation gear, such as kayaking or kayaks, life jackets, tents, outdoor cooking gear, etc. Adaptable outdoor recreation equipment. It's a great thing to include in the grant, and that can be expensive, so it's a great use of the grant funds. Environmental education materials, such as telescopes, water testing supplies. Education trunks, such as, it's like a take and go. So you might have a skin, skulls, and track trunk, or a aquatic wild trunk, things that you could just grab and go and do a program with. Those are totally allowable. I mentioned before safety gear, which we define as hats, water bottles, t-shirts. There may be exceptions to this here and there. So if you have a question about whether your safety gear is allowable, please let us know, and we can let you know if that's okay or not. Computers and electronics for participants. If you have a justified need, we can allow that, such as tablets for citizen science projects, things like that. Okay, and this, I'm transitioning now to the timeline. So the timeline, as I mentioned, well, the applications, I did not mention this, but the applications opened on August 1st. So you can start your application at any point. The deadline, as I mentioned, is November 1st at 5:00 p.m. Central Standard Time. Grant awards are announced on March 1st, and then we will have that March 1st to April 15th time to be aware of, where no funds can be dispersed. Even though you can start your program, we just can't refund or give you the advance until April 15th or later. And then if you are funded, you will be required to attend a grant management webinar, and that's going to be sometime in late March. And then, as I mentioned, the project performance period, so all your activities and everything that we can refund, that we can fund, must happen between March 1st, 2025, September 1st, 2026. We do expect quarterly reports every 3 months, with the first one due by July 30th. We do take these very seriously, and it's one of the ways that we rank your success as a grant applicant for your next, should you apply again. So you will get reminders for us when quarterly reports are coming up, and if you are late, you will get another reminder that you are late. And if you're late too many times, we take that again. We take that super seriously. And then there'll be a final report due 45 days after the end of the grant period, and that's when everything must be closed in, reimbursements submitted, etc. So when you submit your grant application, what happens? So what happens is, and this, by the way, is on page 8 of your program guidance. There's more information there. So what happens is we put together a team of experts within TPWD, and these team of experts review your grant application and give it a score, much like you are taking a test and you get a score when you take a test. So we scored your grant application on these areas. So the co-op priorities are worth 15 points. What we look at there are access, we assess the quality and efficiency of the proposed project outcomes as they relate to the co-op priorities. And as a reminder, those co-op priorities are outdoor recreation, environmental education, conservation. We also consider the quality of the proposed project's involvement of participants in sustained direct connections to Texas Parks and Wildlife sites, programs, and personnel. So what is the quality of your program, and how deeply are you connected to TPWD sites, programs, and staff? 30 points, which is obviously a lot, is related to serving those underserved populations, which is the point of this grant. And again, we define those as minorities, females of any age, low-income households, individuals with a disability. The extent that the proposed project includes these 3 priority demographics, the higher you score, the more you target those. And you must actually target 51% to even be considered in this area. Your project can serve additional demographics, but projects that prioritize and serve primarily these populations will be more competitive. We also consider, is there a clearly articulated plan demonstrating a reasonable probability that the proposed project will reach the target demographics, and a feasible plan to track and report demographic information. So as Jessica will share when she's in her section, if you can't, if you're not sure how you will plan and track a demographic group, do not include them in your grant proposal, because we hold you to whatever you write in your grant proposal. Again, you don't have to serve only these demographics, but you will want to serve at least 51% in at least one category to be competitive. The quality and depth of exposure for project participants to engage in direct connections to Texas Parks and Wildlife sites, programs, and personnel will score the highest in this section. When we look at the impact of your project, again, that's a hefty score, 30 points. We're looking at, are your goals fully developed? Are they specific? Are they measurable? Are they attainable? Are they relevant? Are they time-bound? And do they present a high potential for success? Jessica's going to take a deeper dive into developing goals in her section. We look at the extent to which the project will develop lifelong behaviors consistent with the program mission, with preference to projects that engage participants in multiple experiences over an extended period of time. So rather than just a quick visit to a park, multiple visits, deeper, higher quality programming. The extent to which the proposed project will contribute to the development of successive generations of natural resource and outdoor recreation leaders or professionals. We look at the activities, how the activities, do they utilize a hands-on active engagement approach to skill development versus sitting in a classroom and listening. We also look at the quality of the tangible environmental benefits resulting from the activities conducted by the participants. So all this relates back to the impact your project is likely to have, and this is where your points will come from there. We also put 20 points on the timeline and budget. Here we're looking at, is the timeline acceptable? Does it include detail that accounts for all project phases? Is it achievable? Is it logical? And does it correlate with the project narrative? We look at the budget. Are the items allowable? Are they reasonable? Are the costs reasonable? Are they clearly supported by the proposed activities? The budget. We also look at to ensure the budget reflects consciousness of cost effectiveness and provides a reasonable return on investment with respect to participant impact. This goes back to some of the things I talked about earlier related to lodging and food. Organizational capacity. This is only worth 5 points, but I will remind you that points are won or lost in a couple with just a few. So it's important to consider this. We look at the proposed project. Is it within the scope of the applicant's mission? Are the staff listed qualified, and are there resources in place to effectively manage this grant from start to finish, or has the applicant partnered with an entity to provide staff and or resources necessary to manage the grant? We want to also make sure that the organization plans to continue similar activities and will maintain grant-supported supplies and equipment after the grant period ends. So that's a quick glimpse. This is the detail of how your grant application is scored. We also look at, once we've scored the application, we note past performance. So if you've had a grant with us before and you weren't able to successfully complete your grant for project, there's various reasons this happens sometimes, but we have the authority to take off up to 20 points for your future grants. So, and that stays on the record for 5 years. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And so this is why when you're developing your grant proposal, you want to ensure that you have included only projects you are sure you can do with the numbers and scope of the project, as well as ensuring that you're able to reach those underserved populations and document their how they're eligible for that. I want to talk a little bit here about things you should consider about your capacity to manage the grant should you get a grant award. First of all, consider the timeline. So there's some logistics involved. You'll be able to know if you've gotten a grant award on March 1st, but remember, you won't actually get funding until April 15th. So when you're developing your timeline, you want to factor this in. So you don't want to probably factor in a project, a camping trip or something that first month or so of your grant award, unless you have enough funds and a history of success in taking those participants out. However, it's a great time to do recruitment efforts, to get everything lined up, to get your staff and partners lined up. So just kind of factor in when you're doing your timeline. Remember that you won't get funding till the 15th. Also factor in the weather and what kind of backup plan you'll have if you get rained out and you have a camping trip. So just think carefully through your timeline. As I mentioned before, payments and documentation, it can be a lengthy process. It's we ask for a lot of documentation to get reimbursed. And so someone will need to lead this effort, stay organized, collect those, and then submit the payments and documentation. So be sure you have the organizational capacity to manage that well. It can be an administrative burden for small organizations. As I mentioned, you want to consider the weather and what happens if you need to cancel. So if you are, for example, partnering with Texas Outdoor Family, which is a program that it's an allowable program, that the TPWD program that takes families out camping. It's a great program, but weather happens. It's Texas, and sometimes they have to cancel. So if that happens, what's your backup plan? Because we still hold you to, if you say you're going to serve 30 participants, taking them camping, we're still going to hold you to that outcome. And it might be a little different than camping. It could be that you set up something for a 1 day, whatever, but just make sure you have an outdoor, that you have a backup plan for any outdoor activities. And as I mentioned, be sure to be aware that whatever you write in your grant application becomes, and once it's approved, becomes a legal document between TPWD and your organization. So you want to ensure that what you write is what you can actually carry out, and be aware of those compliance and deductions. And if you recognize that 1 or 2 points can make or break a grant award, whether or not you get a grant award, you can appreciate the impact those deductions might have on your future. So again, just be very aware as you're developing your project plan. So I mentioned all applications must be submitted through the Recreation Grants Online or ARGO system. I'm not going to go too much into this. We've learned from history that it tends to be overwhelmed at this point for you, but I just want to mention it, show you what the screen looks like. The easiest way, honestly, you can follow this long link, or you could just Google TPWD Co-op grant and you will find this top of your list. Do start an account early. Support is available. We have our wonderful Blake, who is a great support. So if you have trouble creating an account, something goes wrong, you want to know that early, not the day of. You can start your co-op application anytime. It's open and waiting for you. Do be aware, we have all kinds of resources. Once you're in the ARGO system, you'll see the resource tab. Wonderful, wonderful, long list of great stuff there to help you along your way, filling out your grant application and developing your programs. ARGO is also where you can view other available opportunities. As I mentioned, we're one of many grants available through our recreational grants branch. So this is where you will find the other grants that we offer. So with that, I think this is, yeah, we're here. So we will have a 10-minute break. So it's 1:48. So let's come back at 2 o'clock. And then you'll transition with Jessica, and then you'll be taking a deeper dive into actually writing this grant application. Thank you so much.
everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of our co-op grant application webinar. In this section, we're going to really dive into different parts of the application and talk about some best practices and how different parts are scored and essentially what we're looking for in different elements of the application. Just a reminder, you can ask live questions. Rena and I have switched positions. She'll be answering questions for the second half as I present. Also, we are going to have a special guest at the end of this segment. Sarah will be presenting about Texas Parks and Wildlife's Project Wild program. In our resources section, you can go ahead and pull up the blank application if you'd like to follow along with me. That's not needed for this section. I'll have some photos on the screen. But in this section, we'll talk about the project proposal. We'll talk a little bit about SMART goals and the narrative and the timeline that the application is asking for. We'll take a deeper dive into what Texas Parks and Wildlife relationships and resources are eligible for this grant cycle. I know a lot of you also had questions about the demographic section of the application and reporting. So we're going to go through what that looks like on the application and how you can create that section. And then last but not least, we'll talk a little bit about creating your budget and your grant application. All right, so to get us started, our application cycle opened on August 1st. Again, you have a blank paper copy in your handouts, but just remember the actual application needs to be submitted electronically in our recreation grants system. So let's kind of take a big picture look at the 6 sections that make up the application. The first couple sections should be pretty easy for most of you. It's some general information, some information about your organization in the applicant section. There's also some acknowledgements and eligibility and legal statements that you need to sign off on. You do need a UEI number. This is required for all entities applying for state funds through our grant program. Those of you familiar with previous applications, this takes the place of the DUNS number. There is no more DUNS number. If you have a current account in our Argo system as a previous applicant, you will need to log in and replace that DUNS number with a new UEI number. And if you have no idea what either one of those are, that is okay. In the application, there is a clickable link that will take you to the sam.gov site where you can go and request a UEI number. You're not required to complete the full registration in that system. Just ask for the UEI number. Keep in mind that Texas Parks and Wildlife does not administer the sam.gov system. That's a federal system that assigns the numbers. We have no control over the speed at which they do that or the status of your request. It can take up to a month. If there are issues, I've seen it take a little longer. So it is required that you have the UEI number in order to apply for any state grant funds, including the co-op grant. Other parts of the application, the actual project information and additional details of your project, as well as the participants you are proposing to serve, and then the project budget. Let's start with a very easy part, or what appears to be easy in the application. After you fill out the sections about your organization and all of your legal and eligibility documents, we start to go into project information. And one of the first things that you'll be asked for on the application is project key personnel. And at first glance, this seems pretty easy. But the reason I'm bringing it up is we do notice a lot of people lose points in this section. On the application itself, it's asking you to list all of the key personnel that will be involved with your grant-funded project, directly involved. You'll need to include their title, a brief summary of their duties, and their qualifications. That helps us to determine that they are either qualified to teach the parts of your program you're describing, or if you have a plan to get them qualified as part of your grant proposal. If you have positions that are not hired, like let's say your project involves a summer day camp, and under the grant, you'll be asking for funding for seasonal summer camp counselors. It's perfectly okay if you don't have a first and last name. You can just put to be hired or TBD, to be determined, but be sure and include their title and their grant-related duties and what qualifications they will have to fulfill that position. So again, just put to be hired in that name box and be sure to fill in the title and grant-related duties. Especially when we hit the budget section, when we see that as grant coordinators and on the grant review panel, if you're asking for funds for staff, we'll go back into this specific section to learn more about the staff that you're asking for grant funds for. A couple of tips here. We don't need like your senior level staff, your CEO or something like that. Those should not be included here unless they are actual boots on the ground interacting with program participants. Now, you can put things like your bookkeeper or accountant if they will be supporting the grant. You should also put any volunteers that are going to be directly involved with your project. So it does appear to be a pretty simple part of the application, but again, we do tend to see a lot of people lose some points here. So just take these as a best practice when you're filling out this section. All right, the next section on the application is where you are describing your project. It will ask you first for a project name. This isn't necessarily worth any points, but we do appreciate a catchy name of your project. Sometimes we get a name like Smith School Elementary Grant Project. We do a press release and we are required to send all of our grant awards out to our legislatures in your district. So it's nice to have kind of an exciting name for your project. You can get real creative. The second element in this section is a project summary. And I want to encourage you to keep that short and sweet. That project summary is limited in characters, and it really should be just kind of your elevator speech about what your project is. If I didn't read any other part of your application, it should be summarized in this section. That project summary section should be very clear and concise. You don't need to explain what the mission of your organization is. That was in a previous section. It's just the summary of the project that you are asking for grant funds for. The next section in the application is incredibly important. These are SMART goals. Now, some of you may be familiar with the SMART goal format, and for those of you that are not familiar with the SMART goal format, we do have a very specific tutorial that's available in our Argo resources that has lots and lots of advice on crafting SMART goals, as well as lots of samples that you can adapt to your own project. In our application, we're asking for SMART goals in a bullet format, and these are your deliverables, your program deliverables. Specifically, what is the program? We need measurables, meaning how many kids are going to be served. It needs to be attainable. It needs to be time-bound. and it needs to be relevant to the grant priorities. The SMART goals should be very concise. They need to summarize all the different aspects that are in your project. So if you have a day camp element in your project, and then in the fall you have a after-school archery program, each of those would be a separate SMART goal in your project. So SMART goals really need to include every aspect of your project. Think deliverables and outcomes. Let's take a look at two different SMART goals. So I have two different SMART goals here. We're going to look at what SMART goal gives the most accurate and measurable understanding of your project scope. So between these two goals, is it specific? This would include lots of details and kind of address the who, what, where, and when. Does it have some type of measurability? We do track the progress of your project throughout the year, and so we need some type of measurable deliverable. Is it attainable? Is it realistic? Is it relevant? And we also are looking for it to be time-bound. Now, you don't necessarily need to say it's going to happen on March 13th of 2026. Sometimes just an approximate time of year will do. If we're looking at these two goals, let's look at the first one. Youth will successfully participate in the Shoot Safe Archery program by attending mentored practice sessions, participating in competitions, learning teamwork, and increasing archery skills. Now, all of those elements are eligible for a co-op project. The problem is this is not a specific measurable SMART goal. We really don't know how many participants are involved in this project. We don't know how many competitions that they're attending. Learning teamwork would certainly not be a measurable outcome of your project. And it's also really difficult to measure increasing archery skills. So while this first goal certainly contains elements that are allowable in a co-op project, what we're looking for in this section of the application need to follow that SMART goal format. Let's look at the second goal. All Outdoors will host a 4-day, 3-night camping adventure during spring break at Cedar Hill State Park for 25 families from the Autism United Parents Group, leading guided sensory hikes and basic camp setup training. So we have several elements here that are hitting that SMART goal format. There's a lot of specifics. It's a 4-day, 3-night camping adventure. There are elements that are measurable. They're saying they're serving 25 families. There are elements that are attainable. I can see just from this goal that is a very attainable goal, very realistic. It is certainly relevant to the co-op priorities. And there's a time-bound element here. It says they'll be doing this project during spring break at Cedar Hill State Park. So when we're talking about writing SMART goals on your application, these are not goals like learning teamwork, increasing confidence in the outdoors. Remember that none of that is really measurable. It doesn't include any deliverables, and it's just way too general to assess any outcomes. We really need to understand the specific scope. So where, when, what skills are they learning? What types of activities are happening in your field trip or your camp out? The more specific you can make your SMART goals, the more points we can score and award you in this section. Again, if you've never really written SMART goals, we have a fantastic resource for this. Some people just take a lot of the examples and they're able to adapt some of those examples directly to their project. And if you need any help with this section, of course, both Rena and I are more than willing to help you craft some of your SMART goals. The next section of the application, we really consider this the meat of your application. This is one of the sections that certainly will take up quite a bit of time. The narrative section is where you provide all the details of the proposed grant-funded program. If you go back to your SMART goals in the last section, all of your SMART goals really should be flushed out here. This section should not include things like academic research. We really don't need a justification for why being outside is good for kids. All of our reviewers work for Texas Parks and Wildlife, and we're well aware of that. What this section is, it's the opportunity for you to provide a greater description and additional details about your project so that we can score your project as high as we possibly can. This section should include things like exactly who you are serving for each element of the project. If your project, again, has a summer day camp in the summer, an after school archery program in the fall, you're going to describe each of those in great detail. We need to know what activities will take place, including what types of outdoor recreation activities are incorporated. So if you're doing a field trip to a state park, we need to know, are you doing an interpreter program? Are you going on a hike? Are you going kayaking? Are you going rock climbing? We need to know exactly what type of activities will take place. We need to know when and where the activities take place. Now, you don't specifically have to say it will take place at Brazos Bend State Park. You could just keep it more general. Maybe Brazos would be booked during the time you want, and you could just say it will take place at Houston area state parks. That's fine. It's specific enough to really allow our scoring committee to understand your project. It's also very important to include how long your activities will last. When we're scoring your application, we are looking at depth of understanding and depth of exposure, meaning contact hours. So if you're proposing, for example, a field trip, if this is a full day field trip and your participants are spending 6 or 7 hours at the park learning different kayaking skills or rock climbing skills, that is scored very different than a school field trip that's for 1 hour at a state park and they're having a picnic and then departing back on the bus to their school. Both of those are allowed, but they are scored very differently. If you don't provide the information about how long your activities will last, it's difficult for us to give you the maximum score. How frequently participants will be engaged, I can say that overall, our committee strongly values quality over quantity. So those projects that are serving 5,000 participants and each of them spends 2 hours at a state park and that's it, we do fund those types of projects. But I will say that a project that is serving 50 participants and they're meeting 10 hours each month to learn outdoor recreation skills, that shows a lot of progressive skill building and is a much more impactful program than kind of a one and done program. But again, you need to include those types of details in this narrative section. Is there repeat exposure or progressive skill building? That's really how you achieve the maximum amount of points in this section. Also, we're looking to see if your staff are trained. If you're including any specific staff training, like Wilderness First Responder, Wilderness First Aid, Project Wild certification, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Angler or Archery Instructor programs, be sure that that is also included. If you are partnering with another organization, be sure and include that in your narrative as well. And last but not least, we need to know that you have fully developed this project and you are thinking about risk management plans, safety elements, training for your staff, and contingency plans for weather. The one thing about grants that fund outdoor programs is weather always happens. So what is your plan if it's pouring down rain the weekend of your camp out? We still hold you accountable for delivering that camp out. What you describe in this section of your narrative and in your SMART goals is what it ends up in your legal grant agreement, and we expect you to deliver all of those elements despite weather, and we want to see that you have thought about a plan if you're impacted by that. Okay, let's really dive into the required Texas Parks and Wildlife relationship. The intent of the grant is to connect underserved audiences to Texas Parks and Wildlife, our sites, our programs and trainings, or our staff. And this can look like a lot of different things. Those of you who have seen the application this year will see a change in how we've formatted this so that we can really focus projects on our parks, our sites, our fisheries, our wildlife management areas, all of the different programs and trainings that we offer, and what opportunities there are to engage with Texas Parks and Wildlife staff. We have a specific document that outlines all of these opportunities. I'm very happy to say that document also includes clickable links. So if you are interested in having a game warden come and talk to your participants, please refer to our Texas Parks and Wildlife Approved Relationships document. You can click on the game warden link. You can look at what game wardens serve your specific county, find their names and their contact information, and reach out to them and see if they would be willing to provide you a commitment letter that you can include with your application. On the application itself, this is what it looks like for this cycle. You would simply place a check under any of the sites, trainings or programs or staff that will be included in your project. Now, the goal here is not to check every box. If there's a box checked in this section of your application, it would need to be reflected in your SMART goals and in your narrative. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this section. The elements that have a star next to them do require a commitment letter. You will not receive credit in your project for a TPWD relationship unless the commitment letter is uploaded as required. So what elements need a commitment letter? Most of the elements that need a commitment letter are very specific to your project. So for example, the Texas Outdoor Family Program has limited capacity, and you would need a letter from them saying that you've spoke with them, you understand the partnership requirements, and they're agreeing to take you on as a partner. This would be the same for our Buffalo Soldier Heritage Outreach Program. And this is to ensure that people are not just writing kind of crazy things in their application, that the Buffalo Soldier program is going to come to their site twice a month and deliver half-day programs for the entire school year. Unless you have a commitment letter from our Buffalo Soldier staff, we will not give you credit for that element of your project. You have to have a commitment letter. Now, that being said, if you are doing an overnight camping trip at a state park, you would not need a commitment letter. Those parks are open to the public. Same with some of our instructor trainings. If you are sending 2 staff to a Project Wild training somewhere around the state, you do not need a commitment letter for that. You may want to reach out and explore that a little further to understand the cost and requirements of those programs. If you put that our Project Wild staff is going to come to your summer camp site and train 20 of your staff in Project Wild, that element has a star next to it because they have a limited capacity and they would need a commitment letter to ensure that that part of your project would really happen. If you have questions about any of the TPWD relationships, please reach out to Rena or myself. We can help connect you with different park resources and staff resources and programs. The commitment letters themselves need to be requested early. As you may know, many of our staff do not sit in front of a computer, but they work out in the field. They may need up to a week, more or less, in order to agree to your request and get you that commitment letter. If you're requesting a commitment letter 2 or 3 days before the application is due, they are not required to send you that commitment letter. So please reach out to our staff, our sites, anything you would need a commitment letter for nice and early, and give them time to provide that. I will mention that in our resource section this year, we do have a template. It's very simple to just fill out. You can send that template to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Program or staff that you'd like a commitment from. They can sign off on that document and send it right back to you. So that makes it nice and easy. The next section of the application is going to ask you for a timeline. So a couple of things to consider here that we often see are overlooked. Remember that the actual period of performance for the grant is March 1st of 2025 to September 1st of 2026. All of your programs and purchases need to happen within that 18-month period of performance. If you are planning projects that happen in March, it's really important to be realistic about spring programs and events. Remember that our grant agreements, all that administrative paperwork that we require from you can take up to 30 days. If you are planning a spring break day camp, the 3rd week of March, just consider that you may not get notified about your grant award until March 1st. And if that's the case, are you going to have enough notice and the funds to hire staff, purchase equipment, do all your participant recruitment by the 3rd week of March? We generally really encourage folks to give themselves a bit more time. That being said, if you've run a spring break program within your organization for the last 10 years, it's perfectly fine to do your program in March. Remember that special events are not allowed. So there's no Earth Day festivals or anything that's open to the general public, and that's because you are required to collect individual demographic data, which we'll take a deeper dive into in just a moment. So on the timeline, we don't want you to put like planning time or partner meetings or anything like that. We're looking for specific project date ranges. It doesn't have to be super specific, like March 13th of 2026. It could simply be spring of 2026. But we kind of want to know the order of things, keeping in mind that period of performance. One other thing here, you have the opportunity in the application to upload an itinerary. Again, this is not required, but I would really encourage you to consider uploading an itinerary. It doesn't have to be for every element of your program, but having an itinerary really provides an opportunity for our scoring committee to give a deeper insight into the depth of your participants' experience, the impact of the program. Maybe it features some of the lessons or curriculums that you'll be including on a field trip. And that allows us to actually award more points for your overall project. It just gives us a much deeper insight into what your participants are actually doing and the impact of your program. One more best practice about our timeline section: make sure that anything you have in your SMART goals or narrative are aligned with this section. So if you have a goal that describes a dad and daughter fishing program that's happening in November, I would expect to see that program on your timeline. It's very important that these are all well aligned and described. Let's jump into the portion of the application where we get the most questions about, and these are participants. We really focus in on this because the intent of the grant is to reach underserved audiences, and there are some really specific rules and eligibility factors here. So the first thing it's going to ask you for is the total number of unduplicated participants you are expecting to serve with your grant-funded program. Now, there's a temptation to put a really big, impressive number here, and I want folks to really think about that. We value quality over quantity. And if you're unable to actually serve the number that you propose on this line, it would make you ineligible for future grants with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I encourage everyone to be conservative. The number you put on this line transfers into your legal grant agreement if you get a grant award. If you think you will probably serve 100 kids in your summer day camp, go ahead and put 75 or 80 and give yourself a little bit of breathing room. Unduplicated participants are just that. They can attend multiple events, but they're only counted once. The demographics section is worth about 30% of the overall scoring. And again, it's the primary intent of the co-op grant. So this is very important. You can find more information on page 6, on page 6 of your program guidance. We define demographics as the following: minority, females of any age, low income is described by the USDA food eligibility guidelines or by federal and local poverty guidelines. And then individuals with a disability, this can include physical, intellectual, behavioral, developmental or learning disabilities. Caretakers or family that are accompanying disabled individuals are also allowed to be counted in this category. And I want to stress, I actually had a question earlier on the first half of this webinar. If participants need to meet all of these demographics, they do not. We do not expect that all of your participants would be a Hispanic female who is low income with autism. The idea here is that you are serving at least 51% of any one group. The expectation is that you're not necessarily serving all four. Now, you may have participants that fall into one or more demographics, and that is absolutely fine. Oops, let me go back to this real quick. The idea here is that you need to be collecting actual participant demographics. We're going to ask you in the application how you plan to collect actual demographic data, and we do require you to report this, and we can audit this information. So there are a couple ways that you can do this. If you do not have a way to collect low-income data, keeping in mind that sometimes families don't want to share that information with you and won't share that information, then do not put that on your application. Only include the demographics that you know you can collect demographic data for. So how do you collect the demographic data? Here's a couple ideas. It really depends on your organization, your project, but many of our applicants have past program demographic data to justify what they're proposing, and that is subject to audit. You could also include a commitment from a partner organization, like maybe the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, a specific school, who already have that demographic data and they agree to provide it to your organization. That requires a community partner letter that states that, and it's uploaded with your application. Now, a lot of our grant programs partner with schools. You can use school demographics, but there are some specific rules here to follow. I know many people go online, they find all of the demographic data for an entire school district. So the entire Austin ISD, and they use that demographic data, but in reality, they maybe are only serving 75 students. So that would not be acceptable on your application and you would not receive scoring credit because there's no guarantee or justification that those 75 kids would reflect the demographics of an entire ISD. Now, if you are serving, for example, all of the 4th and 5th graders at one specific Title I school, and you provide the demographic data of that specific school, that is much more reasonable. In some instances, it would be great if you could have a letter from that school that agrees they're going to work with you. And last but not least, a lot of our grantees simply do self-reported data from individuals. So having your participants register for a program and ask for information like minority or gender or something like that. Now, in our experience, when you're doing self-reported data, if you're asking folks to report income, oftentimes they will not include it, and you may find yourself coming up short in collecting that data and receiving a penalty because they didn't answer the questions. So on this section of the actual application, just remember you are required to report individual participant demographics for the actual participants served. And again, if you're not able to collect data for a certain demographic, then don't include that in your application. You also need to include an explanation and assurance of how the percentage you're proposing will be met. And that's what we score this section on. So even if you put 100% of your participants are proposed to be minority, you would need to have an explanation and assurance in order to actually receive points in this section. I do always caution folks about putting 100%. It's good to kind of give yourself a little bit of flexibility. I've seen programs that say we're going to serve 100% females, and then 2 of the girls have their little brothers show up and they participate, and it throws off your data. So if you think you're going to serve 100% of one demographic, I highly encourage you to put 98% or 95, just to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. And if you have questions about this section of the application, again, please reach out to us. We do not give credit for census data or zip code data or neighborhood data that's not specific enough to document who will actually be participating in your program. All right, last part of the grant application is your project budget. And I'm really happy to share that our budget is quite simplified. If you've ever applied for other budgets, it can take a little while to really complete this section, but I strongly encourage you to use the program guidance and make sure you are crystal clear on what is allowed and what is disallowed under our grant program. We will remove any ineligible expenses, and that amount cannot be replaced. The other part of the budget in the application, consistency and alignment are incredibly important. When you are doing your budget, I really encourage you to go back to your SMART goals, go back to your narrative, go back to your timeline, and make sure that everything is aligned. Oftentimes, we'll read through an application and we'll get to the budget, and the budget has all kinds of fishing supplies and archery equipment. Yet in the SMART goals, in the narrative, there was not any discussion at all about fishing in the programs or archery in the programs. So you want to make sure your budget reflects the project that you've described in the rest of the application. The budget is separated into a couple different sections. Personnel, remember that all personnel that are funded by the grant must be directly related to the project, and they should be included in that key personnel section. This includes things like if you're paying stipends or internships, those also should be included in the key personnel section. Food and travel would also be detailed here. Fees would include things like campsite fees or fees to rent a dining hall at one of our parks or shelter, service projects, and then supplies. Just a tip on supplies, we do not require that you itemize every single supply. So if you are doing a project that involves fishing, you would not need to line item bobbers and another line item for poles and another line item for worms and another line item for reels. You can simply just put fishing supplies. Same with something like kayaking. We don't need you to itemize the life jackets, the paddles, all kinds of, it can just be kayak supplies. It gives you a little more flexibility. Let's say REI donates all your kayak paddles, then you still have kayak funds to buy other things. Here's just a quick little sample. You see personnel in Fringe, summer camp counselors, there'd be 4 at a cost of 1,000. Interns, this is also where you'd put contractors. And then you can see on the supply line items, all we're really expecting are more broad stroke, like camping supplies, kayaking supplies. And there is a box at the end of the application where you can explain what types of items are included in that budget summary section. Whew, so I am sure your brains are quite full. We've given you a ton of information. But at this time, I want to take a minute to have you listen to a very special guest. Sarah Josie is the Project Wild coordinator for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Project Wild, Project Aquatic, Project Wet, Project Learning Tree. These are all very popular parts of co-op grant programs. A lot of our projects send their staff to become Project Wild certified in the state of Texas. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah just for a few minutes to talk about the Project Wild program. Once Sarah is finished, we'll come back and we'll have a live Q&A with both Rena and I to try and answer any of your lingering questions. And then we'll wish you well in your application. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. You see, am I able to share? Oh, there we go. And what can I ask, are you guys able to see my presentation or my desktop right now?
Is it a rabbit with?
Nope, it should be a presentation, so let's swap screens here.
I see a rabbit eating some prickly pears.
Which is fabulous, but not what I was trying to share.
There you go, you got it.
You have to
Let's
so just go ahead and start your slideshow and you should be good to go.
Great, but now can you hear me? There we go. All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Jose and I'm with Project Wild. Project Wild is one of the many programs that we do here at Parks and Wildlife. And we train environmental educators. And so it's really exciting to think about, you know, our planet is growing with people every day. Our natural and wild places are diminishing, hence this program to get people out and exploring. And so we hope through Project Wild that we can get people to think about conservation, use our natural resources wisely. The programs are really easy to use. They do work indoors and outdoors. For those of you who serve formal classrooms or students, these do correlate or align with our TEKS. And if you have teachers in your program, we do give CPE credits for teachers through TEA. And they develop a lot of skills. We talked a little bit about skill formation at this workshop, but analysis, classification, just good observing and problem solving. But we don't only serve teachers. So K through 12 classroom teachers, sure, but also youth group leaders. My background is from nature centers and field trip sites. And so I'm a Project Wild educator and I've used it at outreach events, on field trips, those kinds of things. I've used it with summer camp staff at nature centers. If you run an after school program, it's really good for that. But also agency people who might be coming and presenting to the youth you work with, parents and community groups. So it serves a really broad audience, which makes it a really nice, flexible program. So what might it look like to use Project Wild in your program? It's lots of games and group activities. So everybody loves a good model. Here's a bunch of people pretending to be deer and food and water and thinking about how many things can live in an ecosystem. There are guided explorations. So maybe you have somewhere to go outside, but you don't quite know what to do when you get there. Well, we've got lots of lessons that can show you how to do that. And they are cross-curricular. This isn't just science, it's also social studies, reading and writing, things like animal poetry and researching reports, physical education, again, back to those games, some running, some, instead of freeze tag, quick frozen critters. And the idea is that we're increasing comfort being outdoors and awareness of conservation issues. You know, if we don't talk to young people or adults about these issues, they don't become aware of them. And so Project Wild is just a really great way to share some of these concepts. And so what that means for you and for anybody else who wants to use it, we support 3 guides. And so you'll see it in some of the documentation as the Wild Suite. Project Wild is our parent guide. It's made for kindergarten through 12th grade, although I've used it with Texas Master Naturalists and seniors from a senior center, so things can be scaled up and scaled down. It includes 81 activities. Its water partner is Aquatic Wild. There's 55 activities related to anything water, not necessarily water quality. That's Project Wet that Jessica referred to earlier, which is not affiliated with us, but is another professional development that you can receive. And then those of you who work with younger children, ages 3 to 7, maybe early childhood centers, Head Starts, preschool, homeschool, we have our Growing Up Wild, which is 27 activities, just again, get them interested and engaged. These guides are really thorough. So every activity has this really nice set of objectives, a grade level, how much time do you need? How many people do you need? It's got background. So you do not need to become an expert. You're going to get the background information you need to lead those activities with others once you've come through a workshop and you've got the book. It has procedure instructions, which is pretty key, vocabulary that you might need. And for Growing Up Wild, there's also a song and a snack for every activity. But those guides also have extra materials like field safety and ethics guidelines. So if you're looking at this grant thinking, I've not really taken people outside, well, there's tips for taking students outside and how to be in the field ethically as far as protecting our resources, what we should and shouldn't collect, how to make sure that we're not adding harm to the environment, but instead exploring it safely for us and for the environment itself. Information on service learning projects. We talked about resources that could go to a service learning project. Maybe you don't know how to do that. Well, Project Wild can actually help you integrate that, show you how to do that. So lots of good materials in these guides. And the way you get your guides into the hands of the adults so that you can turn around and do the activities with children is through educator workshops. We host educator workshops across the state in that good planning that we've been talking about this afternoon. They are somewhat sporadic. We have partners that do them. I also do them across the state. So you certainly would want to plan ahead, or once you get your grant, reach out and ask if there's going to be something in your region. But Growing Up Wild is a 3-hour workshop. Project Wild or Aquatic Wild is a 6-hour workshop. All of them are $35 a person, and it comes with those hours of credit and that guide. But if you did want to do a dedicated training just for your team, if you've got a team of 10 or more, again, then we can hopefully pair you with a facilitator, come to you, do the workshop on your site, get a feel for what it really looks like to do this in your backyard and on your campus and those things. And so where do you find it? Where do you find more about it? We do have a website on the TPWD website. You can also just Google Project Wild, Texas Parks and Wildlife, but we're affiliated with a national program. And so I've got our fishwildlife.org site here as well. And that's where all the student pages are. You can read a little more about what it's correlated to. Many of them are correlated to Scout badges. So any of you who are serving Scouts maybe would be interested in looking over that material at first. And then I'm always available for questions. So it sounds like our Project Wild contact information's in the main presentation shared today. My direct email is here, as well as my work cell phone. Happy to answer questions, happy to talk to any of you about getting this curriculum in your hands and getting more people exposed. Those of you who have maybe done Project Wild previously and want to lead it for others, maybe you want to become your staff developer, we also have the ability to become a facilitator, and that's a $50 fee, and you would then be able to teach Project Wild, Aquatic Wild, and Growing Up Wild to others in or outside of your organization. And Jessica and Rena, thank you so much for your time today, and happy to answer any questions, but gonna hand the screen back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for the updates on the Texas Parks and Wildlife side of those programs and those specific programs. We're going to start to wrap up, and we'd love to have your questions submitted. As you guys submit your questions, we do have a little checklist, and I'll just kind of go over some of those points. We do encourage you to start early. We do often have folks who don't meet that 5 p.m. deadline on November 1st. And again, that's a really hard deadline. Make sure that you have a signed and dated resolution. We have several templates and examples of the resolution on our resources page. Make sure that you've reached out to your Texas Parks and Wildlife relationship, whether that's our staff, whether that's one of our programs or trainings, whether that's a specific park or program. Go ahead and reach out to them and make sure that it's realistic to include those in your grant project. And of course, if you need to have a commitment letter, make sure you ask for those early. And of course, make sure you use the program guidance to just make sure that all the things that you're asking for funding for as part of your projects are eligible. We do encourage you to be conservative so that you are able to meet those goals. And then again, just make sure that your application is well aligned, that the SMART goals you're describing are reflected in the narrative, in your timeline, and throughout your grant. And last but not least, please reach out to Rena or myself. We are here to help, and we will go ahead and start to take questions. If you don't have any questions, you're welcome to log off, and we wish you well in your application.
So Jessica, we have some questions. This one actually might be more appropriate for Sarah, but the question is, do you need to renew Project Wild trainings?
Ooh, hey, Blake, can we unmute Sarah to answer that question?
She's unmuted herself.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so there's not a need to renew, but if you have done it before 2017, you probably do not have the newest version of the book. Jessica, I just emailed you my presentation so they can go look at the covers. If your books don't look like that, you might be interested in coming back, but there is not a need to renew it annually or every 5 years. Once you have the materials, you have them and you can keep using them.
Okay, I'll write that.
Great. Thanks for answering that, Sarah. Yeah, there's definitely the kind of the Texas component of Project Wild, right?
So the guides themselves are national. They are not specific, but again, they all got updated in the last few years. Project Wild has been in Texas since 1985. So your site or you personally might have a pre-2017 guide, and it might be time for you to seek out a new edition.
Awesome. Thank you. I think it's probably time for me to seek out my recertification. Great question, guys.
Okay, another question is, regarding the administrative burden, could you give a guesstimate on how many hours each quarterly report takes?
Wow, that's a really tough question because it depends on the complexity of your project. We've had projects where the whole project is 1 week of summer camp, and obviously those are pretty simple in terms of quarterly reports. We've had other projects that are serving thousands of people with archery programs and staff certifications and things. Those are a little more complex. But overall, I can tell you our quarterly reports are just that. We're asking for any programs you delivered over those 3 months. We're asking to have you report the actual data. So it kind of depends on how organized you are and your system for collecting that data. We're asking you a couple simple questions, if there's anything you need and how things are going. And overall, it's not a really in-depth quarterly report. You're mostly just reporting the programs you've delivered, any challenges you've had or help you need, and of course, most importantly, the demographics you served for that quarter. So my answer to that question would be, it probably depends on how complex your grant project is.
Another question, are Project Wild guides available in Spanish or other languages?
Sarah, I'm going to turn that one over to you if you're still there.
Perfectly. Yes, Growing Up Wild is now recently been released as Creciendo Wild. It is available in Spanish. Our facilitators, some are comfortable doing it that way, some are not. But you can certainly order that one in Spanish. Unfortunately, the other two are not. And Proyecto Wild used to be available, so if you've seen it, it's no longer in print. It was a selection of activities.
Okay. I haven't pre-read this, so I'm going to try it. For the demographic requirements, if we are serving people with disabilities and our participation form report gathers this information, we don't have to gather income, ethnicity, and male-female data, correct?
That is correct. Again, the objective is to not necessarily serve all 4 categories. I would say the majority of our grants serve 1 or 2 of those demographics, and they serve them well. So if you're an organization that specifically serves individuals with a disability, and you would say maybe 80% of your participants fit that demographic, and you listed 80% as the target in your application, that means that as you're going through your program delivery and reporting that data on quarterly reports, the only thing you are required to report is that specific demographic, individuals with a disability. So whatever you're including in your application are the only things that you have to report and are accountable for during the grant period. So that is why we say if you don't have the ability to collect low-income demographics, for example, then please don't include that as part of your grant project. Just include the things that you are able to collect and report.
Okay, one last question, unless another one comes in. I'm curious if there's a way you are able to connect potential applicants within a region. It would be great to see how applications can leverage each other to create robust programming and services to the community and avoid duplication.
I'm not sure if that's a question that I can answer. I can say that throughout the history of our co-op grant program, we have served pretty much every region of Texas. A lot of our workshops, as Rena and I are on the road, and when Carly and I were previously on the road, we do strategically plan a lot of our outreach in our workshops so that we kind of rotate around. So if we're not getting a lot of applications from Amarillo, say, then we make a real deliberate effort to head on up there and reach out to a lot of the community groups. We do not facilitate partnerships. That's really not in the scope of our work or our grant. The scope of our work is providing funding to community leaders that serve the underserved communities that we're trying to reach. So not sure that I answered that question, but I'm not sure if it was a question.
I think so. I think, yes, I think you did. I think the question was, is there a way to connect potential applicants together within a region so they could collaborate and avoid duplication? And I think you did answer that. We really don't have a way to do that.
That's really outside our scope as a grant program, but there are lots of, what am I trying to say, professional organizations in Texas that does exactly that. So I would kind of keep your eye out for some of those.
Okay, we have two more questions that have come in. For the budget section, how do you break down number of units for things like contract employees and program meals?
Good question. I don't think there is one right way to do that. It probably depends a little bit on your specific project, and Rena and I would be happy to kind of consult with you and talk through that. But overall, a general answer would be if you're going to hire a rock climbing guide as a consultant, if you're going to hire a kayak teacher as a consultant, each of those would be listed out separately. And I've seen that listed in the budget as maybe the number of hours and their rate. So let's say you're going to hire a rock climbing consultant for 30 hours at $30 per hour. That would go on that specific line item. If it's a multitude of contractors, I'd say maybe reach out to our staff and we can kind of help you figure out what that would look like on a line item. What was the second part of that question?
Food, same question, but related to meals.
I've seen this a couple different ways. Depending on your project, I've seen folks do it on a per person basis. So let's say you're serving 50 participants and you're seeing them once a month for 10 months and you guys are serving lunch and snacks and drinks. You may just want to do it as a cost per person. I've seen it done that way, and that usually lets us assess if that's a reasonable cost. I've also seen folks kind of split it out per event. So if it was a field trip to McKinney Falls State Park and it was the food for 30 families, that might be one line item. And then your next line item might be your field trip to Cedar Hill State Park,
for 20 families, and then it would just be one amount for that line item. So I think there are a couple ways to do it. The important factor there would be we just need to assess if it's a reasonable cost. So if it's, you know, a giant catered barbecue event for $75 per person, that's where we start to see some red flags, and we need to be able to assess that.
Okay, we have one more question so far. If you have a previous UEI number, do you need to renew?
I don't believe so, but I just want to stress that Rena and I, our recreation grant staff, and Texas Parks and Wildlife as a whole, we have nothing to do with SAM.gov and issuing of the UEI number. You will want to reach out to SAM.gov. I recommend logging into that site and making sure that your UEI number is still valid. It's what we will do once we get your application. If it's not valid, could be an issue with your application. So if I was in your shoes, I would log into my organizational account on SAM.gov and make sure it's active and good to go.
That is the end of our questions.
All right. Well, we wrapped up just a tad bit early, but Rena and I are both around if you have additional questions. Hopefully you have both our contact information by phone or by email. Again, the applications are due on November 1st before 5 p.m. We're here to help, and we greatly look forward to receiving your applications. Thank you so much for attending today.
Hey, everybody, this is Blake, Systems Administrator. To Jessica's point about the due date of the applications, just want to stress to everybody, I would not cut it close like that. The submit button disappears promptly from the system at exactly 5 o'clock and 0 milliseconds. It will not be there 1 millisecond past 5 o'clock. It's a very common thing that happens, that if people miss the deadline, the button that does remain is the option to withdraw the application, and they wind up withdrawing it and they think there's a technical glitch. There is no technical glitch. The system will strictly enforce the deadline. So just be sure to give yourself plenty of time to get that application in. Do not leave it to the last minute. Things happen, connectivity gets lost, computers freeze up. It's just not worth it. So pretend like it's due on the 31st, right? And that way you'll definitely get the deadline down. And if you're gonna submit it on the 1st, just be very aware that if you're anywhere close to that 5 o'clock hour, you're not gonna have the option to submit it after 5 o'clock.
Thank you so much, Blake. And that is really heartbreaking when that happens, and it usually does happen every year. So start early. We wish you luck. And again, thank you so much for coming.